everybody, my name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the Director and Managing Editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to see you all again for the latest edition of DFR Lab Coffee Break. Today, I'm super excited to welcome DFR Lab non-resident senior fellow and fellow government alum, U.S. government alum, Cindy Otis. Cindy has spent a decade as an intelligence analyst, briefer, intelligence manager, specializing primarily in security issues in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. And then she joined the private sector in 2017, where she's been a leader in kind of building industry standards about disinformation and shaping how this industry and frankly field of expertise is developing very rapidly around a rapidly developing set of issues. So in her new and highly topical book, True or False, a CIA Analyst's Guide to Spotting Fake News, Cindy shares actionable tips on how to approach this whole situation. So we're going to talk about, if you haven't checked out the book, it's available on July 28th. Definitely get a copy. It's a truly great read. And we'll dive into the questions that we have for our coffee break. So in the book, True or False, Cindy, you chronicle how misinformation and disinformation have kind of always existed, even prior to the advent of social media. However, over the past year, we have these big topics that are sustained news events that everybody's extremely focused on for good reason, because they need information about these topics, whether it's coronavirus or the racial justice protests, or even elections that are upcoming here in the United States. And so how does misinformation and disinformation shape some of these events, and how do you kind of see these events developing over the near term?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Graham. I'm excited to be here to talk about this obviously very important issue. So in my book, True or False, I do cover sort of the historical view of this issue and how and disinformation and fake news have been used throughout history to influence events. And I talk quite a lot about how various actors have really tapped into fear and strong emotions, anxiety, anger, panic, and all of those things to share and spread particular narratives. So nowadays we're in a unique environment. It's something that we call the infodemic, because the sheer scale and scope of the misinformation and disinformation circulating right now is just really unprecedented. And it's sort of interesting on publishing timelines. You're writing books that then get published a year or two later. And when I sort of set down the proverbial pen in writing this book, I had no idea that just a couple of months later we were going to have a global pandemic and national unrest over police violence that would kick off this infodemic. So we're really living in a very unique time. But those same attempts to use things like fear and panic and anger to shape and push particular narratives is absolutely something that we're seeing now today. We just happen to have social media and technology that makes this, as I said, the scale and scope of it very unprecedented. So, I'm sure, Graham, you've seen it yourself, and certainly the folks who are tuning in our own spheres. We've seen things like rumors and conspiracies and false information going viral about things like the origin of coronavirus, for example, the number of cases spreading and things like that in different areas, all the way down to already a lot of misinformation and in fact disinformation about an eventual vaccine, and the things that are happening, and how effective that will be once we do finally get a vaccine. And we've seen foreign actors like Russia and China push conspiracies about coronavirus, particularly targeting countries that are in their sphere of influence, and things like that. And then on the national unrest side, there are so many rumors and conspiracies circulating about things like outside agitators or rioters or dangerous looters that are coming to American towns to essentially topple and take over these cities, that are based in, no evidence whatsoever, but are circulating in large quantities, almost daily in some cases, on social media platforms, and are having real live impact, of people showing up to different sites expecting protesters and finding none, or looters or dangerous individuals and finding absolutely none, or people being harassed and targeted because they're suspected of being members of these sort of outside agitating forces. And because of this very sort of amped up tension, and this sort of high emotional time period, that tends to turn off that critical thinking parts of our brains where we see information and would otherwise question, ask ourselves questions like, where is this coming from? Is it true? Can I do any research to check to see whether this is accurate information? Because that sort of side of our brains is not quite as strong as I wish it were at this moment in time. We're seeing people too, as we have throughout history, increasingly embrace conspiracy theories and lean toward those extreme sides. So when we look at an event like the 2020 presidential election this November, a lot of worrying things sort of keep me up at night. Things like false information already circulating about the election's integrity and the voting process. I'm anticipating, lots of rumors and conspiracies using coronavirus as a way of discouraging particularly certain communities and marginalized communities from showing up on voting day. And then also a lot of narratives that call into question the results of the election afterwards. So, it's a unique and scary time.
I think we share some of the kind of freak out topics that really make us nervous. But one of the things that I really, really appreciate about your book, True or False, is that it takes this kind of big, not that tangible challenge that is fake news or misinformation and disinformation, and it breaks it down into practical steps that people can actually incorporate into their own lives, right? Like the moment where they're sitting at their laptop or sitting on endless Zoom calls or like doom scrolling on whatever social media platform. And they're looking for good information that they can make decisions about their own lives and livelihoods. And the nice thing about this book is that it's kind of a how-to on like, okay, well, here's the moment that we're in and here's the steps that you can take. And I think it's applicable to not only the moment and the news cycle events that we see right now, but it will be relevant in the next year and the year after that, as events develop. And so it's a cool how-to and process book, and you have this wide breadth of experience as an analyst yourself. So what are the give us a little bit of a preview on what are the first steps when you see something that is a little bit suspicious or feels a little bit off when you're doing your own investigations online.
Right. Yeah. Well, first, thank you for saying that about the book. Absolutely, my intention was to create a book that would be useful to the average information consumer with tools and tactics that they could employ in their own sort of daily lives to improve their social media habits and the way with which they consume information. So some of the things that I talk about in the book are, without spoiling it, of course, are things like understanding how your own biases and your own sort of experiences, just living your normal life, affect the way that you interpret information, the kinds of information that you end up even clicking on, and how you sort of judge whether information is accurate or not, which I think is a really important foundational step to just understanding how you process things, really. But some of the other steps that I explore as well and teach in the book is, when you come across a post on social media and it says something that maybe really agrees with what you already believe or really supports what you already believe, there's still a lot of steps that you should take to investigate that information to make sure that it's accurate before you share it. So things like looking at the source, are they, the account that's pushing it, is it one that you're familiar with or not? Is it somebody that you can research and look up and see if they have expertise in the issue they're talking about? Are they citing sources that you can also investigate? Are they citing a website where you can go onto the website and you can look for sort of red flags or signs of actually being reputable and credible that we would traditionally associate with a news site? You know, on a website, you should be looking for things like, are there, you know, are the articles kept up to date? Are authors listed? Are there typos? Are there dead links that might suggest, you know, if there are dead links, that it's not well maintained, it's not a regular, you know, sort of news outlet, or it was very hastily cobbled together, perhaps through a WordPress template. Those are all sort of red flags that you can look out for. So it does start with understanding where you're coming from on information based on your own lived experiences and your personal biases, investigating sources, and questioning the information that you see before you share it.
At the DFR Lab, we kind of think about disinformation and this set of challenges as a collective challenge. And so to zoom out for just a quick question, we kind of think about this as a collective challenge that involves, you know, government, where we used to work, and media, a bunch of journalists that we talk to all the time, and then the social media platforms who are kind of grappling with this set of issues, and a bunch of other people. So what can, in your view, what can like larger institutions do in order to kind of take their own part of what this collective responsibility looks like?
Well, it'll come as no surprise that we feel very similarly on this issue. In my book, I talk quite extensively about how this problem isn't just a social media problem. It's not just a problem for government. It's not just a problem for for the private sector. It's an all of us problem, and all of us have to be part of this solution. And everybody has their role to play. Government has its role in regulation. It has its role also in investing in organizations and institutions that help teach things like digital media literacy in schools, outside of schools, in communities, and things like that. Academics have their role to play in researching and uncovering, the nature of the threat and tracking its evolution. Nonprofits have their role to play in everything from sort of election security and the piece of how disinformation and misinformation affects elections, to the, again, digital media literacy training and all of that, working with journalists. The media, of course, has a huge role to play. Some of the best investigative work being done right now is being done by reporters on the disinformation beat. And then, of course, organizations like the Atlantic Council, where I'm very happy to be, play an enormous role as well in educating the public. And then, I do take the approach, and it's why I wrote the book, that there is just a significant portion of this issue that needs to be tackled by the individual information consumer, because disinformation and misinformation start and stop with people. You have actual people who are seeding the information, and then you have actual legit real people who are falling for it and spreading it. And so that individual component is really huge in making sure that people are adopting good practices in terms of how they consume information and how they share it.
As individuals, we all kind of have at least one person in our lives, whether it's a friend or a family member or a colleague, somebody that's kind of in our immediate reach or ecosystem, information ecosystem, who dabbles in conspiracy theories, right? Who spreads misinformation, maybe disinformation, right? But like, how do we as individuals kind of approach that situation, right? Like, we all, the hypothetical Thanksgiving table conversation where you have a family member who is spreading conspiracy theories, and you have to say something because you're at the Thanksgiving dinner table. But how do you approach that? How can we communicate with each other on an individual level about misinformation when it's spread, at the moment that it is spread?
Mm-hmm. So this is a great question. It's actually the number one question I get from folks, which I actually think is very heartening, because people are just looking to be able to have these relationships and maintain these conversations and help each other. So I actually think it's a very hopeful thing, that people are interested in finding solutions to these. I'm not, just because I'm the disinformation lady in my family and in my network of friends and colleagues, doesn't mean that I'm immune from these conversations. In fact, in my close network, I have people who absolutely believe in the deep state. conspiracy. And in conversations that I've had where I've said, okay, let's walk through this, right? So I'm former CIA. You know me. You think I'm a good person. I hope that I am. I try to be. You know that I worked really, really hard to protect the country. I'm telling you, there's no deep state. Um, the response to that is usually like, yes, I know you. Yes, love you. Think you're a good person. Think you worked really hard. Maybe you just didn't get your invitation to the deep state. Maybe you just weren't invited to be a member. So it's happening. You just don't know it.
Which is kind of offensive in the other way, right?
It's slightly offensive that maybe I wasn't aware enough, or it was just not cool enough. I don't know. But so these conversations are really challenging. I would say a couple of things that can help. So first, would really discourage folks from entering these conversations as if they want to win an argument, as if it is an argument and it's something that can be won. Instead, approaching these conversations as just trying to share good, helpful, and accurate information, trying to help spread awareness, not a combative, not an aggressive conversation. You're just not going to win in that scenario when you enter something like that, aggressively. So the first part is sort of like keeping a good mindset and keeping a good tone in these conversations. Another point is, and maybe it's a little easier for folks like us to do, but it's absolutely something, others can do as well, is just helping people understand where their information is coming from, the things that they're citing, who's actually generating that content that they're citing, right? So a lot of people don't know, and this is something that I spend a lot of my time on these days, is tracking these very large networks of political, quote unquote, news websites that are actually run by for-profit political consulting firms who also do, digital marketing, that use these websites to collect data on, the visitors that they then turn around and sell. They're for a particular, political side. So you're not getting unbiased, accurate information. You're getting something that is very much meant to influence your vote, your political leanings, how you operate on a daily basis, and essentially keep clicking on the website. It very much plays on the sort of addictive quality of online media. So a lot of folks don't know that this is where their information is coming from. It's coming from politically biased, financially motivated people who are trying to make that content that way and are profiting from your clicks. So just providing that information when you have it, when you've done the research about who is actually behind that information, I find can be helpful. And then the third thing that I would mention is the conversations where you're mustering your side of sources and I'm mustering my side of sources, and then you sort of deploy, or each person deploys their sources which vehemently disagree with each other. I mean, that's the end of the conversation. There's no sort of point at that point when everyone's sort of mustering their side of sources that happens to agree with them and prove their point. So would discourage folks from sort of approaching conversations that way. Certainly the reverse of that, and then the better method is to, when you're providing sources, provide direct from the source itself. If you're talking about health information, you're citing health organizations run by scientists and healthcare workers and things like that, as opposed to a politically biased website run by a blogger, for example, that has opinions about health but no background in it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's something that we kind of try to incorporate in all of our work as well, where to take your point, to not make a fight out of the facts or your body of evidence, or being more right than the person that's spreading misinformation, as well as kind of providing more transparency or lifting up information to say, okay, well, have you considered this? And then I take your point on kind of calling it a day, or knowing when to call it a day on arguments, right? To say, okay, well, today we're going to agree to disagree, and we'll maintain this dialogue, especially for the people that are kind of in our immediate spheres, right? Like, these are friends and colleagues, and frankly, for me, I share your experience in like conspiracies related to working in government. And it's like, I trust you with my life, and you know me. I think that you would probably trust me with your life. And yet we have come to a pass on this. Right, like, and the point on not being invited into the conspiracy theory is always that has cracked me up a little bit on in multiple scenarios with like friends from high school. Um, with the book itself, one thing that I think is really cool, especially because we have a lot of young people that work with us at the DFR lab, is that the way that it's written is geared towards young adults and what they can do, and this is a generation that is digitally native. One of the first generations, that I should say, that's digitally native. They've grown up with the internet. They're uber online, and it's just a different information environment for them. And so, how do you kind of approach that? What did you kind of think through when you were writing to make sure that it would make sense or matter to that community? And does it make it also relevant? It's still relevant for like older folks, right? Like for our parents and grandparents, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very accessible for an adult audience. It was really, when I was writing it, I was aiming for the sort of mental image that I had in my mind as I was writing it. Was I just want this to be a chat between me, Cindy, the former CIA analyst who spent a career wading through, learning how to wade through just huge amounts of information and find, the fact from the fiction, and the individual reader. So I really tried to make it very accessible for the range of audiences who would be picking up this book, and make it, as we mentioned before, very actionable, regardless of sort of where you're at in learning how this works and the kinds of tools and tactics you need to employ for a better online experience, and to make sure that you're not contributing to the problem. But it's primarily aimed at young adult readers for a couple of reasons. So one, I absolutely am a big believer in the transformative power of literature written specifically for the targeted audience. And, as a reluctant reader myself, when I was a kid who found that one book, that turned me into a lifelong reader, it was my hope that, this book could maybe have that sort of impact on the younger generation. But as you mentioned, the primary thing was this generation is more online than any other generation that's come before. To age myself a little bit, I grew up in the era of the internet becoming a thing, right? In people's households. I still remember the moment my family got its first computer. It was a very, memorable day, because it was a big deal that families, were starting to get computers in the home.
You had to
And
literally
with
dial
internet,
it up.
you had to dial it up. We had the little jar next to the computer where, if you were going to spend, one or more minutes on the internet, you had to put change in the jar, right, to pay for it, with good old AOL. So, but otherwise, if you had a question about how the world worked, or, a name, a date, anything, an event, you had to go look in the actual hard copy encyclopedia, that we loved in my household. We loved our encyclopedias. Or you had to go to the school library. But for this generation, I mean, they have literally been online. Chances are they've literally been online since the moment they were born, when their parents were taking pictures and then immediately uploading those pictures almost seconds later in some cases. It's kind of scary, onto social media. Um, and so they're just, from the day they're born, just under this fire hose of information. They're on multiple social media platforms for the most part. They're online hours and hours a day for, homework, for school, for fun, for social media, for connections with friends, for their own, interests. And they're just getting a lot of information that, people of my era did not have to deal with. There was one encyclopedia for the letter A. There weren't 50 billion encyclopedias for the letter A when I was growing up. And so my thought was, this generation and future generations need these tools and tactics from the very beginning, because they're online from the very beginning.
That makes total sense. I mean, I can't even imagine being a young adult right now. It's a lot, and there's so much out there, and these skills to navigate that space are incredibly important. and frankly, really, really underreported. That's a long way of saying I would encourage literally everybody to get this book, read it thoroughly, use it as a guide. Um, One last question, and it's a bit of a personal question. You're also a huge leader uh, as a disability rights advocate, a consultant, an author. Uh, how has that work and experience informed your work on disinformation? Because there is a lot of disinformation out there, and how has that kind of evolved over time in your own professional experience, especially in the intelligence and defense communities? What can we what can we learn from that experience and incorporate it into our own work at the DFR lab and elsewhere?
Yeah. So thanks very much for asking me this question. It's something that I'm, as a disabled woman, extremely passionate about, and something that, frankly, um, could use a lot more work and allyship and support from the larger non-disabled community. So I love any opportunity to talk about this issue. So a couple of things. I mean, on the disinformation front, disinformation has used marginalized communities, um, or put another way, marginalized communities have been targets of disinformation for hundreds of years at this point, and it's been a way of justifying, violence against them, of painting enemies when you needed an enemy, to solidify sort of the majority. Um, and the disability community has been a target of that throughout history, from everything from the Holocaust to the era of eugenics that preceded and followed that, in which false and misleading information was used in order to justify things like forced institutionalization and things like that. And we're still seeing narratives against the disability community, that are aimed at sort of dehumanizing the community in order to justify very cruel tactics and regulations by governments. So it's had a huge impact in how I think about disinformation, and in the kinds of disinformation that I look for, and how I investigate narratives that are potentially even playing out in a place like the United States. One thing that I would say too is, so it's the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act, this month on the 26th, and that piece of legislation was always meant to be a starting place. A lot of folks talk about it as it is the end all be all of disability legislation in the world. It is the gold standard, et cetera. It was never meant to be the final end point. It was meant to be simply a starting place. It's simply the bare minimum that should be done in the United States to promote equality within the disability community, or for the disability community. And a huge piece of, I think, getting to that next step in the ADA, and where it needs to go and where disability rights need to go, in order for people with disabilities to operate in their communities completely equally, is that ally component that I mentioned before. The ally role is so important, and I often see sort of allyship demonstrated online as sort of more performative than really getting involved. So you'll hear people pop in with disability rights matter because healthcare, right? Or disability rights matter, look at this time in which a politician mocked a person with a disability publicly. Isn't that terrible? So there's a lot more to allyship than that sort of thing. It's getting involved in your community. It's looking for inaccessibility where you see it. It's making sure that if you're in a company, in an organization, that you are asking, what are our policies, what are our regulations on ensuring that we have a fair and equitable workforce, that we have access to not just our physical buildings, for example, but things like promotions, and how are we keeping our people with disabilities, right? And that's a huge piece for the national security community is where I came from in government, and the community really struggles still to this day with making sure that they are setting the right standards and creating a fair and equitable work environment so that they can not just recruit talented people with disabilities who have the skills to help protect the country, but also retain them as well, and also make sure that they're able to do their jobs once they're there the way that other employees are able to do. So there's a lot of work to do still. But I think a lot of hope for the future, and certainly a lot of need for good, strong allies who are asking these tough questions, who are promoting equality and advancement for people with disabilities.
Right. And not only showing up when it's convenient, but like incorporating that into their day-to-day existence, that acknowledgement, that perspective. To your point about diversity in the broader national security workforce, I mean, it's not just the right thing to do. It's a national security issue. It's an actual
Mm-hmm.
substantive issue. If you don't have the broadest set of perspectives, then we're not going to have the best policy, the most security, the most inclusive outcomes that go back to the day-to-day lives of Americans. And that's something that the the community has made progress on, to your point, but progress is in and of itself, much like on the issue of disinformation, progress isn't in and of itself a solution. So very much appreciate your work on that. Very much appreciate your perspective every single day, and your leadership in this field. Cannot wait for this book to go out into the wild. I know that it's been a process in writing. It's going to be relevant for not only this year, but the year after that, and the year after that. Again, it is True or False, a CIA Analyst's Guide to Spotting Fake News. If you don't have it pre-ordered already, it goes out into the wild on July 28th, 2 days after the anniversary of the ADA. And very much looking forward to A, continuing to work with you, but B, seeing this book spread and take its impact and reach its audience. So thank you so much for joining the coffee break. I should note that I've had coffee this entire time. It is super hot. It's the middle of the summer, so it is iced coffee. Judge me, internet, if you would like to. Cindy, it's super great to see you. I'll see you on the internet here in a minute when we get back to work. And good luck with the launch of the book.
Thank you so much, Graham. This was great.